Research into special populations. Special populations are individuals who are vulnerable to coercion or undue influence due to having diminished autonomy resulting from reduced mental capacity and a lack of voluntariness. Examples of special populations include English as second language immigrants, children and youth, prisoners, the intellectually impaired, etc., etc. In the case of children and youths, this label has been pushed to age 25 due to neuroimaging. In research, there has been a changing focus present from dependence, immaturity, and vulnerability towards competence and listening to their perspectives. Also, including families in research could be problematic, since not everyone in the family has the same interest, that there are competing interests and views present. For example, adolescents might not want to share much with their parents. Parents tend to have more power as they have greater decisional capacity. One must also consider other ethical concerns about consent, compensation, privacy, rights, and confidentiality. For example, Dr. Sol Krugman in the 50s deliberately infected children in a state school with hepatitis to develop a vaccination. Though parental consent was eventually sought after, the ethics was questionable as the form was too wordy and it may have been seen as a form of coercion to ensure their children have a placement in the school. Another example was the Monster Study conducted by Dr. Johnson and Tudor, 1939, from the University of Iowa. They wanted to see the impact of speech therapy on 22 orphan children, encouraging one group to speak and punishing another for a speech impediment. The results were never published due to the Nuremberg trials, and the research had no consent, with children not being debriefed for potential harm after the experiment. These examples point towards the necessity in doing research with special populations. One must consider rights and respect. The dignity and value of the participant in research needs to be considered. Researchers need to prioritize safety first, balancing benefit from risk. Informed consent. This is the decisional capacity of individuals whereby consent needs to talk about the nature of the study, its treatments and condition, its complexity, why this study is being committed and any risks involved. Children under 16 cannot give legal consent, requiring a guardian or parent. The research must rely on verbal or written assent when children become sufficiently mature, and only until age 18 can they give informed consent. Ages 16 to 18 can be considered as a mature young person under specific circumstances that are permitted by the ethics committee. Opt-out consent. This is where parents can choose to opt out their kids from a study involving a whole class. Standing consent. Schools make the judgment to consent for children. When conducting research with children, one needs to consider the child's capacity to understand what the study entails, give out age-appropriate content, and consider the possibility of perceived coercion. Privacy and confidentiality. Privacy needs to be ensured, for if the information is leaked, it could incur stigmatization and affect one's employment opportunities. These need to be discussed up front, properly defined in age-appropriate language, as well as stating plans to counter against breaching confidentiality. These breaches may come about from mandatory reporting or suspected risk of the child in reporting emotional, psychological, and physical abuse or neglect. Compensation and payment. Researchers need to determine appropriate payments, such as, for example, small gifts are appropriate for children since they are not motivated by money, and giving too much money could be considered coercion of the low socioeconomic status or as a form of bribery. Recruitment. Each place of recruitment, whether it be in schools, clinics, print media, etc., has specific ethical guidelines to follow. One must observe practical considerations such as who is recruiting, since you don't want coercion from the teachers, the allotment of participation time, location, duration, if it has breaks, using multiple informants, and if measures and language are age appropriate. In researching about clinical populations, consider risks in mental health risk factors and causes. Remember to take note on the varying factors present, such as personal, societal, economical, cognitive, behavioral, emotional factors, and to measure how they change over time. Mental health conditions are to be tested, and one must observe how these influences thoughts, experiences, feelings, and relationships. In 2004, Dan Markinson had schizophrenia and participated in the CAFE study in the University of Minnesota. He used antipsychotics. He was involuntarily admitted to this study and died 2 days after coming into the study. Did he truly have the ability to consent since he had worsening symptoms? When dealing with clinical samples, consider the feasibility of access, as some conditions require gatekeepers to attain potential participants, such as in support groups, clinics, hospitals, and charities or NGOs. There are also ethical problems in having a placebo or waitlist control, since those in the control are withheld from accessing effective treatment, producing smaller sample sizes, and having an element of deception. Washout studies. These are when there is gradually reduced intake of existing medication to study in drug or intervention-free trials. Symptoms need to be differentiated and risks need to be minimized. So in summary, we looked at defining what special populations are, children and youths, gathering research from families. We looked at bad examples of research into special populations, such as Dr. Sol Krugman's study, the Monster Study. We looked at things to consider, such as rights and respect, informed consent, opt-out consent, standing consent. We also covered privacy and confidentiality, compensation and payment, recruitment, practical considerations, as well as clinical populations, factors that may jeopardize those clinical populations, a bad example of a clinical population study in the CAFE study, and finally we looked at feasibility of access, a placebo, waitlist control, and washout studies. Ultimately, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.